Welcome, everybody, to the first in our series of Ryerson Retail Talks Faculty Talks. And today it's a pleasure to be welcoming Dr. Katie Lebel. And Katie, I'm going to ask you, first of all, tell us about what your, I'm going to say passion, but what your main focus of all of your work is focusing on.
Yeah, well, thanks for it's a pleasure to be the first for the faculty research talks. The thread through my research is really gender equity and women in sport. And I guess for the purposes of this talk, I've recently taken a little foray into the exciting world of sport retail. Just to give you a little bit of a level set on the sport retail industry, it's actually estimated to be worth nearly $208 billion. And while a lot of fashion retailers have taken a little bit of a hit during the pandemic, sport retail is actually up. Some estimates as up around 10%. In North America, the sportswear market's expected to grow 24% over the next 5 years, and that's probably a pretty conservative estimate right now. You probably know the athleisure category is absolutely booming. Retailers like Lululemon are thriving. They're actually kind of the reverse. They're starting to get into the men's category now. And I think they've really benefited from that current work from home landscape that we're all living through. But I also think in a lot of ways, the pandemic has accelerated a broader cultural shift towards athletic apparel and athletic lifestyle products. One of the examples that I always like to kind of point to is actually the Kamala effect. And so it draws into the little US politics. But, you know, right after the US election was officially called, Kamala put out a video to congratulate Joe Biden, and she was out for a run in her workout clothes, right? You're not used to seeing that. And it's something that so many women do, but again, really rarely publicized. And, you know, she's very widely celebrated by sneakerheads around the world for her love of Chuck Taylors, for example. And I think actually at one point during the campaign, Chuck Taylors was trending on Twitter because she had worn them at a campaign stop. So I think the key thing is, you know, the pandemic has accelerated this maybe leisure wear, but representation also matters a lot. And we're starting to see some female leaders move beyond the pantsuits. Can I say that? I think Kamala is probably just one example, but her style choices are really normalizing that broader athleisure trend that we're seeing. And when you pair that with the effects of the pandemic and maybe just broadly consider the scope of sport retail, I think it's been a really taken for granted sector for a long time. And so from the purposes of my research, it's a sector that's probably poised for some pretty exciting disruption moving forward. So that's really what's attracted me to it.
Yeah, and you would think too, Katie, that is part of it. And I know I've heard you talk about it. It's almost like it's getting a push from street. That whole focus, not just gender equity, but gender equity with a capital G and a capital E. We're talking androgyny. You get the gender out of it.
Yeah, the gender neutral side of it, and whether or not that's a current trend, I'm not sure, but it's Gen Z has become really quickly the most influential generational cohort of our time, and they are imagining things in a very different way than we have in the past. I think that can't be taken for granted. They're consuming sport, they're consuming sportswear very differently than their predecessors. They're fluid, right? They're getting their sports news from, you know, snackable highlights on Instagram. They're following athletes instead of teams. They're really flipping the whole narrative on its head. And along with this immense purchasing power and influence, they've also got some really different expectations around things like diversity and inclusion, to your point, and environmental sustainability and social justice. So that's really had a big impact on this as well. And I think it will continue to have a really major impact on the future of sport retail. And I guess I would argue if sport retailers want to be future-proof, they probably need to really have their finger on the pulse of some of these big trends.
Well, let's dig down a little bit further then. So what would you say are, I mean, we've talked about, as you mentioned, the generational influences, et cetera, but what are the shifts that are helping, or what are the elements that are helping to shift how women in sports are viewed?
Yeah, so I think there's been a growing amount of evidence to show the increased appetite for women's sport over the past couple of years in particular. So if you go back and we kind of put a timeline together, in 2019 with the Women's World Cup, their home jersey became Nike's #1 selling jersey ever, male or female. It sold out almost instantly after they won, the U.S. team won, and it actually came out they'd only made 1,000 jerseys available initially. So you can imagine the amount of money that was left on the table there, right? It's incredible when you start to think about that demand and the fact that Nike, a company like Nike, couldn't anticipate that type of demand. If you fast forward, the University of Oregon, there was a big, the Sabrina Ionescu was their star. And she actually put out a call to action for retailers and wondered why her jersey wasn't available. It wasn't available for sale on the Nike website or the university campus store, any of those things. And Nike actually, because it blew up on Twitter, they obliged the request. They developed her jersey. They put it out for sale, and it sold out again in like 20 minutes. A few months later, Ionescu actually was up for the draft for the WNBA. Same thing, less than an hour. They completely underestimated the demand. You couldn't buy an Ionescu jersey. So we've got kind of this consistent drumbeat of the supply not meeting the demand. You think about the orange hoodie actually last summer was another example where it became the #1 selling item on Fanatics. It was huge. It became known for, it was a cultural influencer item where we saw a lot of male athletes and just it became trendy to be wearing this orange hoodie. The WNBA draft is coming up again this year, and it's actually sold out all over again. People just can't get their hands on it. So again, you've got this kind of clear demand for women's sport fan apparel in particular, among both men and women, I would argue. And the shortages are generating headlines, but there's this lag between brands and I guess fan interest maybe. And so I guess the connector there is that anecdotal evidence doesn't really create change. So that's where we're starting to actually come up and do some head counts to actually show and put the spotlight on these severe discrepancies in terms of the lack of availability for fan wear in particular. And maybe that is juxtaposed against the massive sales that we're seeing in, Lululemon is probably one of the top retailers in the world right now because they've doubled down on this women's market and their revenues and their business model have been successful because of that. So there's a bit of a disconnect there.
That's so interesting. The phrases that stuck right in my head right away were fanwear. And then it took me further into, so the brands, they're all vertically integrated. They're the one. Why, Katie? Why would you not, as a brand? Sorry, bear with me. Why as a brand, and you are your own retailer? Why would you not be jumping on it? What do you see as some of the reasons for that?
I mean, there are a lot of reasons.
Putting your feet to the fire. I'm sorry on this one, but
yeah, no, there's a lot of reasons. I think one of the big ones is just there's a lot of bias around the sports sector in general. And the fact of the matter is that we've got a lot of leaders at the top who are white men, and they've just always been trained to think that there is no market around women's sport. And that argument hasn't ever had to stand up against much of a test because that's just been something that's been very accepted. There's not a lot of research that's been done around it, industry research or academic research. So we've got a part to play on our end too. But essentially they've been allowed to get away with that. And the women consumers have just been groomed to expect that, that they don't, that those options weren't a thing. So I think the bias is a big part of it. The leadership at the top is another big part of it. And that's where maybe just, it's been taken for granted in the industry. Retailers have been assorting to Gen X and baby boomers, and they've become a very loyal audience, and they've done really well with that to date. I would argue that the sport landscape, like I said, though, is really changing, and I don't imagine that they'll be able to continue to see those kind of profits in the long term, because at the end of the day, the women's category is the fastest growing category across sport retail, and it's just bad business that they are coincidentally also the most ignored demographic or market.
Am I hearing from you then that sport retailing can have a role or has a role in shifting how that females and sport picture is formed?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about that. So how do you think retailing can shift how women and sports is viewed?
Well, I mean, you think about when my mom always taught me that you dress for success, right? You feel good, you look good, you're going to be successful. And I think that, there's a lot of research that shows some of the barriers to sport for participation, for example. And, I remember growing up as an athlete, it wasn't, I golfed, and it wasn't uncommon for the girls to have to kneel on the first tee so that they could measure and make sure your shorts were long enough. You didn't ever see any boys kneeling on the first tee. They actually used to make my mom kneel on parents too, any of the moms out there. And that can be, in hindsight, it was just something, at the time I was just accepted. But in hindsight, that can be a kind of humiliating experience. That can scare a lot of people away from the game. It's the same thing. You go forward, one of my introduction into sport retail research really came from Dana Bookman, who's become a friend. She founded the Canadian Girls Baseball Association. And I remember talking to her right when she was kind of in the thick of it. And she said, and I asked her, this is amazing. What's been your biggest challenge? And to my surprise, I remember it clearly. It floored me. She said that uniforms were actually her biggest challenge. She had founded this national baseball organization, but uniforms were her greatest challenge. And she told me the story about her daughter, who was obsessed with baseball. And when it was finally old enough time for her to be able to get on board and play for a team, they signed her up, and she was the only girl on the team. And she'd been according to her mom, one of the best players on the team. But at the end of the year, when they asked if she wanted to play again, she told her mom that she didn't want to have to dress like a boy to play sports. She had those big boxy baseball uniforms on. Again, it absolutely floored me at the time. And that was my foray. I started looking into it, and we know sport participation rates drop for girls. I think it's by 22% as they transition into adolescence. We've only got 16% of adult women reporting regular sport participation in Canada. And so could your dress actually be a barrier, something that's completely taken for granted again? Is that something that people are, you don't feel comfortable in your own skin, you don't feel comfortable playing the sport? Is that a real barrier to sport participation, which then, you can extrapolate into sport fandom and all of these other things? But at the time, we actually did a bit of a deep dive. Can I talk about that research a little bit?
Yeah, do it. Yes, of course.
So for baseball, we dug into it a little bit. And again, because this was just such a it really touched me on kind of a fundamental level, I just started walking around and kind of noticing the marketing materials. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine going to Sport Check or Golf Town, and you look at their billboards and the types of images that they've got on their websites. You'll see the boys actively participating with the sports. The images of little girls are all hanging out on the sidelines with their friends. We started counting. We just literally went in and counted what was available for the girls and the boys. So this was 2 years ago, I guess. for the entire baseball season, Rawlings had 98 different options for little boys in a variety of different styles and colors. And for girls, they had 2 pairs of pink pants and a pink glove. For Under Armour, so another really big retailer, they had a gender drop-down menu that had options for men and women and boys. Girls weren't even a thing. And for Adidas, they didn't actually differentiate between gender for their youth product line. It was just a youth line, but it was all boxy boys clothes. So again, almost completely excluded. And we went back and looked at their Instagram accounts, because that's where little kids are getting their ideas, their inspiration for what they think is the next cool thing. For an entire baseball season, there were no posts for any of those 3 retailers with women or girls, aside from a couple of like token Mother's Day posts with some pink it and shrink it items that they thought would be appropriate for moms who might like baseball. So that was kind of a real turning point for me. It just, you're othered right off the bat.
Yeah.
And so if you don't feel comfortable in even shopping and you don't see yourself in the marketing, then, you feel like it's probably not the space you should be in. So to maybe full circle that into your point, I think retailers could show a wider variety of people where young girls in particular could see themselves in the marketing materials and could see that the retailers thought it was important enough to have more than 2 pink gloves for sale for them, that they felt it was important enough to have, whether it's workout gear or uniforms or what have you, in their sizes to fit their bodies. That's huge. That's huge, because then they feel like they're meant to be there and that somebody thinks it's important enough for them to be there, that they're investing in that and making products for them.
And Katie, at the beginning of these interviews, I shared with you that I just bought clubs, and the retailer that I purchased from, and Katie and I have done research together on these sport retailing website offerings. And the male offerings were at 22 and the female offerings were just at 8. And I've coached kids all my life, and it is heartbreaking to see to see how not just females, but guys too, who want to be in a sport community on their own terms about who they are and how they want to develop.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually funny. This has become a bit of a passion project for me, but I've got a young daughter and she needed a new bike. And it was so insanely frustrating for me, because you go on and you look at a bike. There's 2 things. You cannot find a girl's bike that's not pink with princesses on it. It's impossible. And there's a pink tax for that. And so you go on and do it. I encourage you to go in and look at bikes. There's the superheroes, or like greens and blues. There's all kinds of different options for little boys. And they're actually cheaper than the pink princess bikes. I had to really work. I just wanted to get a gender neutral, nice bike for my daughter so she could go out and learn how to bike without, be putting in this kind of box. And it was almost impossible. It was really shocking. And so I keep kind of running into it as she grows and seeing it in different ways. But to actually, it was, for a bike, $10 or $20 more expensive. It doesn't seem like that much, but again, it's othering them and making it seem like they shouldn't be in that space. So,
well, I've got one more question for you before we kind of shift to the work that you're doing to move this along. My question is, are there aspects of sport retailing that you think are catching up on this equity gap or are leading it?
Lululemon is a great example, right? I would hope that the business case is starting to really show that there is a market, and maybe more than that, you don't want to get left behind in this kind of cultural shift that we're seeing in sport right now. And so, like I said, the problem with sport, it's in a lot of ways become a pretty saturated market. And I made this point earlier, but truly, girls and women are the fastest growing market, and so you can't ignore them indefinitely. Women spend twice as much as men on sport apparel. they've got more than 85% of the household purchasing power. So when you've got kind of big contextual markers like that, I think it's going to get increasingly harder for this market to be ignored, because it is the only growth opportunity that we've got. And like I said, there's kind of that consistent drumbeat where, like, how many more times can Nike have a sellout without it becoming obvious that they're just not, they're leaving money on the table. And what we've found through our research is that's really what seems to motivate businesses and retailers to create change. It's that money left on the table.